Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Humanities Institute's Night at the Museum from the Archives Conversations on Filipino America. I'm Malaya Simon Reynolds, and I'm a PhD candidate in history and co-director of the Watsonville is in the Heart Digital Archive. I'm joined tonight by my with colleagues, Dr. Kat Gutierrez, woohoo! Dr. Steve McKay, and all of our fantastic undergraduate researchers, Ian, Maya, Julie, Jose, Janeth, Jacob, and Sharon. They're going to be showcasing their work outside after the program. You guys should all go check it out. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking UP tribe. The Amamutsin tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. Tonight, we're excited to discuss and learn about Filipino American histories in the Pajaro Valley and beyond. In doing so, we recognize that these histories are informed by dynamics of settlerhood, displacement, and racial and class struggle. This event and our Sowing Seeds exhibition has been made possible by many generous supporters, including the Humanities Institute and California Humanities. On your chairs, you will have seen some paper surveys for Cal Humanities. You'll also see some QR codes around the space tonight. Please take a couple minutes to complete the survey and provide us with your feedback on this event. We would really appreciate it. Our students will be collecting the paper surveys after the program, so you can look out for them. I also wanted to note that there was a power flicker a couple minutes ago. So there may, for those of you who live in Santa Cruz, you know there may be a power outage tonight. So be prepared. We wanted to just let you know that because the gallery doors will close automatically in the event of a power outage. So please make sure you're standing away from the gallery doors if possible. But I'm sure we'll all be safe. Before we begin the scholarly panel, I would like to introduce Dean Jasmine Alinder, our principal MC for this evening. Dr. Jasmine Alinder is the Dean of the Humanities and professor in the History Department at UC Santa Cruz. She is a historian of photography, race, and civil rights with a special focus on World War II and Japanese American incarceration. Dr. Alinder has managed and co-curated a number of public humanities projects, including physical and digital exhibitions, and more recently, Resettlement, Chicago Story, a cinematic narrative of a cinematic digital history project that uses narrative film and historical documents to create an empathetic educational experience for all learners coming to the history of Japanese American incarceration and its human impacts. This project was featured at last year's Night at the Museum event. On top of this, we have Dr. Alinder to thank, along with the Humanities Institute, for the funding that has allowed us to hire 20 undergraduate students over the last 4 years, as well as myself over the last couple years. All of our undergraduate students have made Watsonville is in the Heart a really meaningful project for me, Kat, and Steve, and our community partners. So let's please welcome Dr. Jasmine Alinder.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's such an honor for me to be here and to welcome you to this year's Night at the Museum. In addition to serving as Dean of Humanities at UC Santa Cruz, I also served as one of the NIH-funded humanities advisors for the Sowing Seeds exhibition, which is on the second floor. Don't be too scared of the doors closing. You definitely should check it out if you haven't seen it yet. And I'm a board member of the Santa Cruz Museum of Art and History, so it's really wonderful to see this space activated in this way, and we hope that if this is your first time in the museum, it's far from your last time at the museum. I also want to say that I'm very proud to be colleagues with the faculty and students and staff who have made, and community partners who have made Watsonville is in the Heart possible. I can't imagine working with more inspiring faculty than Kat and Steve. And where's Roy? He's outside? Well, that figures. And a more, I think, committed, compelling community partner than Roy Rescio and the Tobera Project. I want to mention that Night at the Museum is an annual signature event of the Humanities Institute. THI, we call it THI, we like acronyms at UCSC. THI is located inside the Humanities Division, and it really serves not just our division, but as a campus and community hub for public engagement, for research, and for student success. And THI has incubated Watsonville is in the Heart, and it seeks to incubate other kinds of community engaged projects like that. And we couldn't do this kind of work without the Humanities Institute. And I want to make sure to recognize those THI staff who are here. Irina Polic is here. Jessica Guild is here. And if anyone can keep the power on, it's Jessica. And Saskia Naumberg-Dunkel is here too. So for tonight's Night at the Museum, we are focusing on this remarkable community-engaged project, Watsonville is in the Heart, and its Community Digital Archive. Before I introduce the members of our panel, I would like to introduce Dr. Elaine Ikeda, who is here to present a very special award. Dr. Elaine Ikeda has served as the executive director of LEAD California since 2000. It used to be California Compact. She's over 30 years of experience in higher education, including researching service learning, volunteerism, and community service. Additionally, she's designed and led retreats, workshops, and learning communities for college faculty, administrators, staff, and students. I need to talk to you about that. Elaine recently co-edited the book Reframing Community Engagement in Higher Education. It came out in 2024 from Routledge. She's passionate about transforming higher education to serve the public good and to build a more just and equitable democracy for all. She holds a master's degree in public health as well as master's and doctorate degrees in higher ed and organizational change from UCLA. Please welcome Dr. Ikeda.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, Dean Olinder. And thank you to the UCSC Humanities Institute for inviting me to be here today. Events like this, they really bring me a lot of joy and hope for our world. And I know that we're at the start of a great program, so I'm going to keep this as brief as possible. For those of you who don't know our organization, LEAD California is a coalition of leading colleges and universities that advance civic and community engagement for a healthy, just, and democratic society. We support and celebrate the work of campuses like UC Santa Cruz throughout California. Dr. Richard Cohn, who passed away in 2020, was a leading voice in the national dialogue on experiential education, civic engagement, and service learning since the 1970s, and he was a guiding mentor in the development and evolution of our own organization since its beginning more than 30 years ago. For 25 years, he directed the joint educational project called JEP at the University of Southern California, from which he retired in 2002. In 1999, we began giving this award in his honor. The Richard E. Cohn Award recognizes an exemplary early career individual who is an emerging leader in the field of community engagement, whose work has had a positive impact on campus and in the community, and who is guided by the best practices of community campus partnerships. It is the hope of LEAD California that this award will inspire all higher education institutions to consider ways to deepen their efforts to institutionalize and sustain authentic community campus partnerships. So I'm really pleased to be here today to recognize Dr. Kathleen Cruz Gutierrez, Assistant... I can barely see her. Assistant Professor of History at UC Santa Cruz as the recipient of this year's award. Dr. Gutierrez holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Public Health and South and Southeast Asian Studies with a minor in Public Policy, a Master's of Arts in South and Southeast Asian Studies, and a PhD in South and Southeast Asian Studies. She has been prolific in her publications and has received many honors and awards in her career. It's especially appropriate to present this award to Dr. Gutierrez at this event, which is featuring Watsonville is in the Heart, a community-driven public history that Kat has co-led with Steve McKay, Professor of Sociology at UC Santa Cruz, in partnership with the Tobera Project, a Watsonville community organization, which you all know that. So, Kat has spearheaded Watsonville is in the Heart's effort to formally archive and thus elevate not only the history of racial violence against Filipino American communities in the region, but also memories of vitality and resilience. I'm going to read a couple brief comments from the nomination materials that we received. In her nomination letter, Dr. Alinder stated, Kat has gained the trust of members of the Tobera Project and other Filipino American community members through her reliable partnership, personal communication, and sense of decorum. She often spends time in the homes of community members she interviews well after oral histories have been recorded and practices respectful and sincere relationship building. It is clear from the archive she has helped compile that Kat prioritizes co-creation with community members, a priority she models for her graduate and undergraduate students and has demonstrated by including 2 community researchers on the project team. And Roy Recio, founder of the Tobera Project, wrote, as a founder of the Tobera Project, it has been a magical ride to bring the stories and memories of our parents and grandparents to life over the last few years, with the nurturing assistance of our UCSC scholars. Leading the way and helping to chart this course of action is Dr. Kathleen Cruz Gutierrez. She has been a staunch leader in presenting our stories in an honorable and dignified manner, such stories that have previously been deemed unimportant or non-relevant in local and national history. Her work, along with others, has helped our community establish a voice and presence to propagate a sense of belonging and pride, which has long been overdue. One of her greatest strengths is to skillfully locate and secure grant opportunities that have propelled and stabilized the Watsonville is in the Heart multifaceted initiative. It was clear from the nomination letters from colleagues, students, and community partners that Kat is respected and appreciated by many. In recognition of her significant contributions and achievements, LEAD California has awarded her a monetary award of $500 and an honorary certificate. Kat, we thank you for your vision, leadership, and commitment to reinforcing the importance of community campus partnerships in the field of service learning and civic engagement. So please join me in recognizing Dr. Kathleen Cruz Gutierrez.
I'd like to call up my husband as well, my only family in the audience, to please come up. He's very tall. It's going to be very funny. I just want to really emphasize and say thank you for all of this. It's going to be very hard to keep back the tears. But this award, as I always say, is a team award. I've learned how to be a better community partner, a better scholar, a better mentor from people like Steve, people like Malaya, people like Christina out in DC, who's really curated this beautiful exhibition. And I'm really only becoming a better person by my work with these wonderful undergraduate students who just truly light up my weeks. And so thank you so much, and thank you to Lead California for doing this work and for really believing in Watsonville is in the heart. Mabuhay.
So now we're going to move to our presentations. Each of the speakers on tonight's panel was an NEH-funded humanities advisor for the Sowing Seeds exhibition on view upstairs. And I know there's some other people here who are also advisors to the exhibition. Can you raise your hand so we can thank you all? Or stand? Raise them higher. Very humble. Okay. So they also really help support Watsonville is in the Heart from its earliest days getting off the ground through specialized seminars with students and now to a multi-UC campus digital mapping project. So for tonight's program, we asked each of the speakers to select images from the Watsonville is in the Heart digital archive, an archive of oral histories, images, documents, and material culture from Filipino American families from the Pajaro Valley that launched in 2022. So for you all, they've crafted lectures from these images and from their range of expertise on Filipino America. So I'm going to introduce all three, but they're going to come up one at a time. Dr. Catherine Sinisa Choi is a writer, historian, and professor of ethnic studies at UC Berkeley. She's the author of 3 books, Empire of Care, Nursing and Migration in Filipino American History, Global Families, A History of Asian International Adoption in America, and Asian American Histories of the United States. The daughter of Filipino immigrants, she was born and raised in New York City and currently lives in Berkeley with her husband, Greg Choi. Dr. Rick Baldoz is a 3rd-generation Filipino American. His research focuses on race, immigration law, and the politics of citizenship. His first major book, The Third Asiatic Invasion, Empire and Migration in Filipino America, 1898 to 1946, examines the connection between the United States' rise as a global power and the racialization of Filipinos domestically. His book won book awards from the American Sociological Association and the American Library Association. His current book project is on U.S. immigration policy over the last half-century, highlighting the interplay between U.S. foreign policy and large-scale population flows to the United States. And then our 3rd speaker is Dr. Rudy Guevara, Jr. He's a professor of Asian Pacific American Studies in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. He's the author of the book, Becoming Mexipino, Multi-Ethnic Identities and Communities in San Diego, and most recently, he released Aloha Compadre, Latinxes in Hawaii. He's a former Ford Foundation Senior Fellow and UC Berkeley Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellow. Dr. Guevara is also co-editor of the forthcoming book, Culinary Mestizaje, Racial Mixing, Migration, and Foodways in the U.S. So I want to mention before Dr. Choi comes up that you should have seen note cards that were on your seat and little pencils. It's not for golf. It's for your questions. So if you have questions that are coming up, feel free to write them down. At the end of the presentations, we'll collect the question cards. We'll invite the speakers to come up and answer some of those questions. Okay? All right, our first speaker.
Okay. How do I find the arrows? Oh, these right here. Okay, yes, okay. Okay. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you at UCSC's The Humanities Institute's annual event featuring Watsonville is in the Heart Research Initiative and the exhibition Sowing Seeds, which is on the second floor. I find With and Sowing Seeds to be exemplary in its community-centered Filipino-American history approach. And this approach features public engagement of the university with UC Santa Cruz's Humanities Division playing a lead role, together with community partners, most notably the Tabera Project. And I'm so grateful and honored to be a part of this. When Professor Kathleen Gutierrez, Kat, presented Professors Rick Baldos, Rudy Guevara, and I with the opportunity to select one object from the Watsonville is in the Heart digital archive, it was a historian's dream. Which object would I choose and why? So, this is my choice. I chose the Filipino Women's Club recipe book, contributed by Juanita Salai Wilson, and which is on display actually upstairs at the Sowing Seeds exhibition. This was a recipe book that was created and sold by the Filipino Women's Club of Watsonville during the 1950s. And the sales from the book were used to support the club. And the recipes were crowdsourced from many women in the community. So why did I choose this? Well, this object illuminates two major points in Filipino-American history. And the first is that women's history is integral to Filipino-American history. Too often, history overall has been a male-dominated and male-centric experience. And many studies about the Filipino-American experience, they tend to focus on the Filipino-American male migrants, and certainly their important work in Hawaiian plantations, California's agricultural fields, and Alaskan canneries. But primary source objects from the With Community Digital Archive, such as this one, this recipe book, provide also an important corrective. The second major point, and which explains why I chose this particular object, is that food history is also integral to Filipino-American history. But it's a history that is bittersweet. On the one hand, Filipino-American migrant laborers contributed to the health of Californians by growing and harvesting asparagus, strawberries, grapes, and more. But growers denied them humane living conditions and decent wages. On the other hand, Filipino-American women, through this book, prepared food for community celebrations as well as sustenance. And in this way, food was also a source of communal care and joy. And so I love how the first page of the recipe book features a recipe for quote unquote broccoli delight by Virginia Salai. So I'm just showing this is another sort of screenshot from the digital archive. And it makes this point that worldliness is also at the heart of Filipino-American cuisine. Contributed recipes reflected the many cuisines that influenced the members of this Filipino Women's Club. And these included, which are here in this particular slide, recipes for Hawaiian-style beef and pineapple, home-cooked meatloaf, Korean meat fritters, and lamb with spinach from the Punjab. These recipes also reflected histories of colonialism and migration from the perspective of culinary fusion. Now, this image is also part of the WITH archive, but it wasn't included in the recipe book. But I wanted to show it because beauty and elegance are also part of the Filipino-American experience. And this is a 1957 photograph of the Filipino Women's Club of Watsonville at a dinner event wearing Filipiniana, traditional dress. And I consider this a gem of a primary source that shows us the faces behind the food contributors of this recipe book. And you know, many of them are smiling. I should also point out, too, that, you know, especially in the first half of the 20th century, so many of Filipino-American marriages were interracial. And so you can see that also in this image. And their facial expressions, dress, and comportment express women's cultural pride and an elegance often missing from history. Filipino-American community expresses itself in large-scale gatherings. And so there's a section of the recipe book devoted to super quantity cooking, yes. It was necessary to put that in because the community needs to know how to prepare cabbage salad for 175 people, a ham supper for 225, and a turkey dinner for 250. Finally, and this is the last slide I'm going to show that's also a screenshot from this object on the digital archive. These Filipino women of Watsonville understood that Filipino-American history is not solely about the past, but also our future. And so there is a space in the recipe book for community members to, quote, write extra recipes here. These Filipino women understood that history is alive and we have the agency to create it and document it. Thank you.
So just the arrow. Okay. All right, I'm a little taller than my colleagues here. Thanks everyone for coming out and for inviting me. I've got 9 minutes, so I'm going to try to hustle through a lot of material here. I chose 3 images, and this is the first of them. Let me just kind of show all 3 of them quickly here. The first one's an alien registration card. Second one's a picture of the first Filipino regiment. And the final one's a sort of picture of, it's called First Date. A young couple in front of an icon of American consumerism, the automobile, right? Very kind of classic American first date kind of story. So all 3 images I chose are from the World War II era, kind of representing young love, patriotic sacrifice, and citizenship. And I think people who are familiar with Filipino American history know that in the decades before the war, meaning World War II, Filipinos were racially disqualified from U.S. citizenship, barred from owning land in many Western states, were targeted by anti-miscegenation laws outlawing interracial marriage with whites, and faced waves of vigilante violence which fueled a national campaign to bar them from immigrating to the United States. World War II proved to be an inflection point for Filipino-American history. Only after the war were Filipinos' claims to Americanness, and by that I mean sort of the right to belong in the nation they called home, deemed to be legitimate and worthy of recognition. The 3 images I chose in different ways reckon with a question that I think about a lot as a scholar and teacher. And that question, sort of the broad question, is who is an American? And sort of more specifically, what criterion do we use as a society to adjudicate the boundaries of inclusion and exclusion? So going back to this first image here of the alien registration card, that's sort of connected to the Alien Registration Act, a piece of wartime legislation aimed at protecting the nation from foreign subversion, so that they had all aliens/foreigners in the U.S. register with the federal government to maintain a kind of surveillance regime over suspected fifth columnists who might undermine the U.S. war effort. So what's interesting about this particular image to me is that if you know Filipino-American history, you might be surprised. Why would Filipinos need to register as aliens? Weren't they U.S. nationals? Which is a very sort of specific, unique category applied to Filipinos as colonial subjects of the U.S. And they were U.S. nationals, but at least according to the federal government vis-a-vis this particular law, the Alien Registration Act, Filipinos were deemed to be aliens and had to register with the federal government and submit fingerprints and a whole series of other kind of surveillance measures. So there's a kind of interesting curiosity here. They're both U.S. nationals and aliens at the same time. Similarly, sort of going to the next image of the first Filipino regiment, there was also a second Filipino regiment, both based in California. So what's sort of interesting here, and this is another kind of footnote in sort of U.S. wartime legislation, the passage of the Selective Service Act in 1940, which sort of more popularly known as the military draft, right, to draft young men to serve in the U.S. military. And when the U.S. sort of entered the war in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, and which sort of more or less happened at the same time as the Japanese invasion of the Philippines, many Filipino Americans rushed to recruiting stations to enlist in the U.S. military, and were turned away, saying you're ineligible to register or to enlist in the U.S. military, and the reason was because you're U.S. nationals. And this was sort of a technical problem. The enlistment forms, you could enlist as a citizen or as an alien, right? Many aliens enlisted, right, to prove their Americanness, but there was no box to check for nationals because it was such a unique category and in many ways an ad hoc category of sort of U.S. Sort of law. So at least for the first 4 or 5 months of the law, Filipinos could not enlist in the military. Right, the White House worked very closely with the Filipino-American community and eventually amended the law to allow Filipinos to enlist, and many of them did, and formed this important kind of regiment that served in World War II. So with regards to the Selective Service Act, Filipinos were U.S. nationals, and I just mentioned they were also aliens. Let me add a third wrinkle to this story. The Neutrality Act, another piece of wartime legislation that, I want to get into the weeds on this, but it was a piece of legislation that was sort of regulated travel to foreign war zones, right, out of fear that U.S. citizens would get involved in the World War II before the U.S. had entered it, right, so there was prohibitions on international travel. And this affected Filipinos in a kind of interesting way because so many Filipinos worked as seafarers, and they went to foreign ports. Their livelihood was sort of affected by this. They could no longer go to many foreign ports, especially in Europe and Japan. So, not surprisingly, Filipinos said, well, we're not U.S. citizens, so this Neutrality Act doesn't apply to us. And the federal government says, no, it does. You're U.S. citizens, at least vis-a-vis this law. So we're left with a really kind of interesting kind of paradox here. 3 different laws passed within about a year of one another. Filipinos are designated by the U.S. government as aliens, citizens, and nationals. To quote my 10-year-old daughter, wait, what? How can you be all 3? How can you be an alien and a citizen simultaneously? So this, I guess sort of the takeaway here, moving ahead towards trying to finish things up here, undergirding the sort of paradoxical status of Filipinos, meaning why they were sort of in this kind of outlier status vis-a-vis the federal government, was the belief that they were an undesirable or suspect population who could not be integrated into American society. And I think there's some important sort of takeaways here as I sort of try to run towards a conclusion here. The social categories, and here more specifically the socio-legal categories of citizen, alien, national, the social categories adopted and institutionalized by the state, citizen, alien, permanent resident, what have you, tell us a lot about the values of a society. It also serves us as a reminder that these categories are malleable, meaning they're not sort of set in stone, right? One group, Filipino Americans, can have their status change in different sort of registers when it comes to sort of their status vis-a-vis the American state. So categories are malleable, and their legitimacy ultimately rests on questions of power, who has it and who does not. So the journey of sort of Filipino America from despised and excluded immigrants to persons of suspect loyalty to patriotic Americans after the war who helped defeat the threat of global fascism during World War II has important lessons, I think, for contemporary debates about immigration. As we sort of return to the kind of election year rhetoric, a kind of discussion that's sort of amplifying the sort of rhetoric around border walls and expanding the enforcement apparatus at the US border, we should sort of remember some of the lessons from Filipino American history and note that walls may offer some measure of protection from external threats, but it also quarantines those inside the wall. A valuable reminder that every fortress is also a prison. Thank you.
Now, as the vertically challenged, let me come back down. Well, first, before I begin, I wanted to just say thank you to the Watsonvilles and the Heart Project, UC Santa Cruz's Humanities, the Humanities Institute, and to all of you for being here. I also have to send a quick shout out to Steve McKay, Kat Gutierrez, who really reached out and brought us all together. Malia being a part of this, and to everyone else who's just sort of been instrumental to this. This has been a wonderful journey, and it's something that I really cherish, and I just feel honored to be also on this panel with Kathy and Rick, and so thank you for this opportunity. So what I want to do is start here. The handheld hoe is the item that I chose, and the reason why I chose it was because when I started learning about Filipino American history, and I'm just going to jump to this picture real quick. This was the image, one of the first images that I saw, and it was really striking and profound to me because it drew me in to Filipino history. And as somebody who is living it but is not also conscious of it, it was something that really made me think about how do I tell this story through this object. And oftentimes, even with the writing that I do, a lot of the stuff that I've done has been intentional because for me, our communities are oftentimes ignored and not part of history. So I've taken it upon myself, and as many of my colleagues have, is to write our communities into existence. Much in which this project is done, the Tobera Project, we have to write our communities into existence because nobody else is going to do it for us. So we must be the ones to take control of that. And so when I look at this, this instrument, it has a heaviness and a weight to it because it was not just an instrument of labor, but a tool of production, which in many ways was how the Manongs and Manangs were also viewed by the agricultural corporations or the agricultural growers. They just saw those bodies, those Filipinos, as tools of production too, not as people, not as human beings. And when I think about, the use of it and the drudgery, stoop labor is hard work. It's literally backbreaking work. And so, it made me think about, how we see a tool, but the extension of the tool is the body and it's the hand that's wielding that tool and how we understand those people's lives behind the tool. Because in many ways, stoop labor becomes racialized labor. It becomes Mexican work or Filipino work, right? And these stereotypes are used to really dehumanize the laborers, in many ways the people who grow our food, because for a lot of these agricultural laborers, they are using this tool to feed a nation that they love and want to belong to, but yet does not love them back and does not always want them. And so this becomes a very point of contention to think about, in that, sort of not loving Filipino America back, there comes the racism and the discrimination and all the other things that come with it. Yet despite all of this, our communities resisted and they endured. And so when I think about this tool, because here we have how others see us, but in many ways for me, this is not how we saw ourselves. This is not how the Filipino community saw themselves. They didn't see themselves as tools of production. They saw themselves as human beings with honor and dignity, right? They were worthy of respect. Because in much of this work is considered, it's considered like low undignified work. Yet for the people that are doing it, it's honorable, it's dignified work. It's just depending who's saying it. And that's one of the things I grapple with when I think about these particular things, is because, you know, for the Filipinos and Filipinas and their communities, this tool, in many ways, for me, reminds me of the humanity of the people that wielded it. The sweat, the blood, the tears that stained the tool that they utilized to feed a country, to support their families, both in the United States and back home in the Philippines. And so this was something that, you know, sort of weighed on me as I'm thinking about it, because they saw themselves not as tools of production, but as parents, siblings, brothers, sisters, friends, etc. That's how our community saw ourselves and each other. And in many ways, you know, we find community in sometimes some of the most, trying times. And so for the Filipino community, you know, this was done through bringing together and coming together in ways that brought kinship and community, not just with Filipinos, but with Mexicans, whites, blacks, and other groups that were a part, because the Filipino-American community was never all Filipino, as Yen Espiritu would say. There was always mixed early on. And so this is who, you know, our community is. And in thinking about how we see each other, you know, I thought somebody called my name. Sorry. So one of the things that I think about is that, you know, and think about this is how we see each other. You know, the Filipinos, they loved, they played, they worshiped, they did all of these other things that other people do. You know, they're not just seen as workers, but much more. And so here, you know, I also drew for some of the photographs of the collection is these men in their suits dressing up for a night out on the town. You know, just like any other young individuals that want to go out and just dance and, you know, feel love and to be loved, all these certain things. These are the things that they did in order to find a semblance of normalcy in oftentimes a hostile world whenever they ventured out of those communities. And, you know, and out of these sort of outings and relationships and coming together with other peoples, they formed families, right? And in many ways, these families are a reflection of how these various groups come together under the Filipino community to be a part of a much larger community and voice that tells, you know, everybody that, you know, this is who we are, you know. And these pictures are a reminder of that. The tool is one thing, but, you know, for me, the tool is also the hopes and ambitions and the dreams that these people had in order to provide a better life for themselves and their loved ones. And so as they started families and witnessed their communities grow and thrive, their children and their future descendants, many of whom are here today, right, in many ways, are the beneficiaries of this struggle, the hardships, and the hopes and dreams that many of these people worked for a better tomorrow. And this tool continues to carry the weight of these stories, and ultimately, it was a means to an end. And what we bear witness to now is how these dreams are realized for those whom they loved. Thank you.
I'd like to invite our speakers up to the stage for our panel discussion. And while they're doing that, can we give them one more round of applause, please? So please fill out your question cards. I can get us started. And there will be people who will collect the cards somewhere. Oh, he's right there. Okay. Hello? Okay. All right, so just to start us off while we're collecting the cards, I was just thinking a little bit about the fact that we have the juxtaposition of the digital archive, or selections from the digital archive, and we also have the physical exhibition upstairs on the second floor at the same time. And I wondered if each of you could reflect a little bit, that came up in various ways in your presentations, about the importance of community archives and what that means and how that can be used in a way to help the erasures that we find in more, you know, traditional or state-sponsored archives. And then also, this is a two-part question. Can't help myself. Also, the juxtaposition between the object and the image. So the digital archive gives us access, it's very accessible, right? If you have an internet connection, you can get onto the archive. But what you lose, and this, I have curated a digital archive before, so this is something that we really grappled with, is the physical objecthood of the things, which we have in the exhibition. So it's just interesting to me to think about these two things side by side, and I wondered if you would talk a little bit about the importance of community archives, and then also reflect a little bit about the digital archive and the museum exhibition as two manifestations of Watsonville is in the heart and the kind of different kinds of work that those two things do.
I can start with regarding the first part of the question with the importance of community archives. I think community archives are everything. I wouldn't be the scholar I am today without community archives. Archives like the Filipino American National Historical Society, the headquarters, National Pinoy Archives in Seattle. And they provide this, it's not just a complement, it's oftentimes a corrective to traditional archives, in which, as you know, Rudy, you were pointing out, many times when you find Filipino Americans in some of those traditional archives, they are literally like commodity objects of labor, and they're quantified. And so there's a humanity that community archives brings, because it gives you a sense of not solely of themselves as a unit of labor, but a family member, a neighbor, as you were saying, and so much more. The second part of your question, I don't know if you want to do the first part. Sure. And then...
Yeah, I probably should have done that as two questions. Let's do the first part.
I'll just add, I mean, one of the things I really appreciate about the project is sort of the way it underscores the kind of the history of the ordinary. I mean, my first reaction when we came here last summer was like, wow, we've got so many photo albums at my house that have the same sorts of pictures, which I've always thought of. I wouldn't say junk, but like, oh, that's something I'm going to have to deal with someday. But they're, in many ways, right, they're sort of so important, you know, you don't think of yourself as sort of, or at least I don't think of myself as making history. But of course, we are always making history, right? And so these sort of everyday artifacts and items may not seem that important in the big picture, but I think this project tells us they are, right? They help to collect a sense of a history. And I think what's sort of so striking to me about this particular project is, for a lot of people, and probably myself included, when you think of Watsonville, you think of the riots, but we don't often think of the persistence of the community that persevered and survived for many generations after. And the reason I know about it is because the families kept all the sort of great material, and it was able to kind of put it together in a really kind of exciting way to tell the story of the aftermath and how the community evolved and developed over the ensuing decades.
Yeah, I think for me, the one thing that I think about is trust. Because if looking at the archive, then looking at the exhibit upstairs, that's a lot of trust for people to share their personal lives with those that are collecting it. And it's our responsibility to do so with honor and to tell that story responsibly. Always keeping in mind the trust that the community has given in doing that. And I think this is what's so beautiful about everything you've all done, is that this, you can feel and see, and if you could touch it, you can touch the love, but you can't touch anything up there, but but you understand the love and the commitment and the respect and the humanity, right, that goes into that, and the people's lives that are all interwoven in this archive, in the exhibit, and how that reflects such a beautiful story that's endearing and will endure, I think. And so for me, trust is very key into all of that.
Okay, do you want to start with the second question? Well, it sounds like, do we have questions from the audience too? Okay.
But do you want me to go
Yeah,
ahead
maybe
and
just
reflect on it?
for a minute.
Yeah, I think it's so great to that we have chosen, like, from the digital archive, but some of the objects are actually here, and that you can see. And there are advantages and limitations to both styles. So the advantage of seeing the Filipino Women's Club recipe book on the digital archive is you can actually see all the pages of the recipe book. If you go upstairs, you'll see it, and it's, a nice sense of scale, but it's behind glass, and you can't, flip through it, so you won't get to that page on super quantity cooking, right? But I think the advantage of having this exhibition is also the context in which the item is placed. And it's an advantage, disadvantage when you're searching online. You can access so much more, but it can also be overwhelming. You're not quite sure, like, what should I look at out of hundreds of items? And so upstairs, what's very beautiful is the context and the care in which the object is placed. And it helps you think about this history of the Filipino Women's Club, of food history, in relation to the other objects and certainly the commissioned artist's work in a way that's not possible on the digital archive.
I mean, it gives a kind of reverence to those objects precisely because they're in a museum context, under glass, which, I mean, if any of you cook the way that I do, your recipe books are not tidy. So they leave marks and traces of the meals that have been prepared. Yeah. Should we move to some of the audience questions? Sure. Okay. I think this is going to Rick. Can you say more about U.S. nationals? Were there others? What kind of rights and privileges did they have?
It's a great question. So I would say the kind of U.S. imperial experiment was in many ways a sort of ad hoc experiment. We'll figure it out after we've taken these colonies, what the presidents of those colonies, what their status is vis-a-vis the U.S. state was sort of work in progress. So it was a unique status, and it was sort of ultimately determined by the U.S. Supreme Court. A lot of people were worried about annexing the Philippines, meaning like kind of U.S. congressmen, because they were worried that annexing the Philippines automatically conferred U.S. citizenship upon people in the Philippines, and they did not want that. There was like a lot of racial anxieties about 10 million Filipinos voting for president and Filipino senators wearing, breechcloths and all this kind of crazy racial rhetoric. So ultimately, the U.S. found a way to sort of split the difference. They were not citizens, but they weren't aliens because they were colonial subjects of the United States. So they invented this sort of new category called U.S. nationals, and that was sort of the first step. They're not aliens, they're not citizens, they're nationals. What that meant was not defined. It was just a way of kicking the can down the road in terms of their socio-legal status. They're neither fish nor fowl, and we'll deal with what that exactly means in terms of U.S. law as we go along. And it turned out to be a big problem for Filipinos in the United States. So I mentioned the problem with the Selective Service Act, right, where Filipino Americans wanted to enlist in the U.S. military, went to the recruiting station, they said, you can't enlist, right? If you were an alien, you could exist. If you were a citizen, you could enlist, but there's no box to check for. I mean, part of it had to do with a similar problem with whether Filipinos could become naturalized U.S. citizens. The way to become a U.S. citizen then, as now, is you're a foreigner and you renounce your allegiance to your former sovereign, the country that you came from. In the case of Filipinos, that didn't make a lot of sense because you're sovereign with the United States, right? Because you were a U.S. colony. So it was another problem where a technical problem, right? Just the forms did not include a box for this unique category that was sort of invented after the fact to try to classify this group as sort of neither citizen nor alien. There's something else, and what that means, again, was sort of unclear. So it was a really sort of unique status. So in terms of the rights and privileges, the big privilege, I suppose, is one way to put it, was that they were exempt from the kind of Asian exclusion laws of the late 19th and early 20th century. So a big reason why you saw an influx of Filipinos into the U.S. in the early 20th century is because, Chinese and Japanese immigrants were banned by a variety of kind of exclusionary pieces of legislation. but Filipinos could not be banned because they were U.S. colonial subjects. They were U.S. nationals. So the big kind of benefit/privilege of being a U.S. national was that you could enter the U.S. as essentially a non-immigrant. You weren't a citizen, but you weren't an immigrant either. You were, again, this thing called a national, ill-defined term. So that's the main benefit. In terms of the negative parts, I mean, they were still racially disqualified from naturalized citizenship. They were still sort of subject to alien land laws, which were sort of written and rewritten in ways to exclude Filipinos once those were challenged in the courts. So it was a really complicated story. Just that, I don't want to take up the whole time, but the question of U.S. citizenship and whether Filipinos were eligible. There was a problem taken up by the U.S. federal court system, and there was dozens of court cases, and about half of them said they're eligible because they're subject of the U.S., and half the judges in other federal courts said, no, they're ineligible. Of course they're not eligible. They're not white, right? They're closer to black than white. So it sort of underscores this sort of ambiguous sort of status of Filipinos, and that the category national itself had almost no kind of clear properties or definition. It was just a kind of way of saying you're not this and not that, you're something else, and we'll figure it out later what that means.
So not at all complicated, if you got that. Very, okay. So Rudy, I've got a very short question for you and then a longer question, if that's okay. Okay, so the short question, I hope, was the short-handled tool the same tool to cut asparagus?
That I don't know.
Did
And
the
I'll be
person
honest and say I
do
don't
you
know.
I bet someone knows. Thank you.
And that was I'll just start
Can you start?
I'm not good at this, but okay, I'm a farm worker for 20 years. And up and down this Santa Cruz County, Watsonville, I work with the old Filipinos. And they are our teachers from drinking, working. Our first thing is drinking. They showed us how to do the straight shots. All right. Well, the hoe, this is I guess, my way of saying it, the short hoe. Because Filipinos are short, so they gave us the short hoe instead of now, the long one. Plus that, it's a heartbreaking back. What was first? Asparagus. The asparagus one, I don't know, it's a long, yeah, it's like a wood, what do you call it, the wood handle with a long one like this, but there is a blade about 3-4 inches long. Then you sharpen it because you poke the asparagus when they start sprouting, and you put it in your finger like this, garrot it, put it in between your hand, between your fingers, and you go and put a pile. And then the next one will do the same thing. A lot of work.
Thank you.
Just to add to that, for the whole thing with the shorthand, and I didn't get to mention this, was that part of the racialization of discussing or giving Filipinos and Mexicans the shorthand hoe was this racial notion that because they're small, they're shorter to the ground, it's not going to hurt them. You know, but if you look and you can see in the photos and even just the stories, it's nothing could be further from the truth.
Yeah. Okay, so the longer question, Rudy, you mentioned that Filipinos were outside history. We know the downside of this, but what about the upside?
It's an interesting question. Wait, say that again.
So the downside of being outside of history, I guess, is not being seen and included, but what's the upside?
Well, I think the upside to that is you keep secret and sacred what is yours. Really. I mean, and for those of us that do this work that are part of the communities, I think oftentimes we get into the secret and the sacred and the private. But again, it comes to that trust. And we're given, and for me, even the stories, like when I've done some of these interviews, there'd be some, you know, gossip and tea just being spilt everywhere about everybody, right? But then right away they're like, but don't say nothing, you know? And so I wouldn't, you know, because for me it's like I want them to tell the story, and I'm going to honor that request. So you know, and in my transcript and my audio file archive, there's a lot of tea in that archive, but it will never see the light of day because that is part of that trust in that private, that secret, and that sacred. And so I think that's a good thing, because something should be kept within the community. And nobody has a right to tell you that you're supposed to share it. That's not your place. And so for me, as somebody that's engaged in oral histories and storytelling, it's important to do that, because that is what also keeps a part of us in many ways.
So this leads to the next question. By the way, you all have fabulous questions. I wish we had a few hours to get to them all, but I'm going to invite you after. I think they're going to stick around. We have a beautiful reception, so when we're done, I'm not saying we're done yet, but when we're done with the Q&A, there'll be plenty of time to come up and ask them your questions. So this is connected to that, the last comment you just made, Rudy, but it can be for anyone. How do you know what stories to share? And how do you create the connections that you need for people to share their stories? You don't have to take it.
No, it's fine.
I thought
Well, I think, you know, going back to Rudy's point about Filipino Americans being sort of outside or on the margins of, let's say, U.S. history for so long. Now I lost my train of thought, honestly. Can you repeat the question again? I just completely lost my train of thought.
You mean the card I just shuffled to the bottom of this huge
Yeah,
pile?
sorry. Oh, yeah.
So
Oh,
it's,
right, that's right.
How do you know what
choose?
stories to tell, and then how do you create the conditions under which really there's a trust form so that you can
I'm so
have them
sorry.
told? That's
Yeah,
okay.
because I was getting lost in like what Rudy's point, but it allows us to be creative, I think, is also part of the upside. And since they've been excluded or marginalized, I think every Filipino American story is worth telling. But it's up to them, you know, if they want to share it or not. And in terms of building trust, I think the connections that we have, the sort of the friendships we've already made, the connections my family had in the community helped me write my dissertation, which became my first book, on the history of Filipino nurse migration to the United States. But that just provided a foot in the door, and then I think it's sitting down with people one-on-one and letting them get to know you, and also telling them that you are protective of what they choose to not share.
I mean, I don't do interviews, so I could take a pass on this, but I'm going to mention one sort of anecdote that I was thinking of. One of my colleagues in my department, in our PhD seminar for like Introduction to American Studies, was assigning work from all our members of our department as a kind of a cool way to introduce our grad students to our work. And so on the day she was assigning a chapter from my book, she said, that my colleague said, how do you choose which things to talk about? Because I'm kind of big historical kind of sociologist. And I never thought of it like that I made a choice. I thought, I'm just telling the story of kind of U.S. empire. But of course, I do make a choice, right? You choose which, could write 5 or 10 books about that topic, right? So it always, there's always a choice to be made about which things, I don't talk about every granular Browdellian, like a donkey farts in Italy and Europe, but there's a kind of, set of choices we all make as scholars, right, of what we want to emphasize to kind of advance the kind of vision of society that we're trying to kind of, illuminate. And in my case, I probably hadn't thought about it as sort of much a product of, as a choice, but I think when I thought about it more, I think it was a choice. I made a lot of choices about what things to emphasize, and I think a couple times when I've given book talks, long ago, people say, "Why don't you talk about the good things about U.S. empire?" It's like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. But that does sort of it is a choice, right? That I haven't chosen to highlight how white man's burden was a great initiative, and we should have seen some of the that's sarcasm. So the larger point is we do all make choices. Mine aren't so much about kind of the stories that I help that I kind of draw from people, but just the framing of the topic at hand, right? There's always choices involved in how we frame things and the kind of arguments that we want to make.
Yeah, I think when I think about the book projects that I've done, it's hard because historians are very verbose and long-winded and write a lot. And in both of my projects, I had to cut out anywhere from 60 to 100 and plus pages in order for it to be a book. And so I used the material for other things, but it's you have to figure, okay, for the book, what are the stories that are going to be in? And it's hard because everybody's story is so fascinating and interesting, and you want to honor everybody's time for sharing those stories. And so I've found, even if it's just a sentence or two, I try to include as many people as I can, and those who can't, they'll come out in articles or other versions of storytelling that I'm going to do so that their stories will carry on even if it doesn't make the book. And so you just got to find how you're going to place it, in the larger context of storytelling through all the various mediums that you're going to choose to do that with.
Okay, one last quick question, and then we will move to our closing. So Filipino history and stories are tied to food and family. What Filipino dish is a representation of your story?
Can only choose one.
And how many people does it serve?
Well, in my family, since I'm Mexican, we have Mexican-Filipino food, so I would say a pork adobo taco.
Getting everyone ready for the reception.
I think, my grandparents migrated to the U.S. in the 1920s, so my dad was born in the U.S. So I think, in some ways, a very American point of view. But I think, to me, the Filipino dish that most sort of defining my childhood was chocolate meat, because all my white friends were like, "What in the world are you guys eating?" Yeah, it's not chocolate.
The Filipino mole.
Yeah, dinuguan. I get it, yeah. I guess I'm gonna choose halo halo, which translates as mix. And, it's part of this is scholarly in terms of what I was pointing out, so many of those marriages were interracial. But it's just my whole experience with family has been a mix of being in New York and being on the West Coast and then trips to the Philippines. And some of us can speak Taglish, and while my mom is fluent in 3 Filipino dialects, and it's just a mix on so many different levels when we get together, and I kind of love that.
And we're all here because we love Watsonville is in the heart. So thank you so much to our panelists. Going to invite Steve and Kat back up on stage to close us, and so that we can have the reception.
Yes, so again, thank you all for coming out and supporting Watsonville in the Heart and really supporting community-based work, right? We are making history tonight, and it's just great to have so many here to celebrate this approach, because it's not about just one topic or one community. It's about this trust and love that we co-create with people. And I don't know about other people, but that's why I'm in this. And we just want to say thank you. We're excited to announce a couple of publications that come out of this. First is our beautiful exhibit catalog. So we just got this produced. It was designed by Victoria Maya. It's got essays from Christina Astron-Planck and Roy Rescio. And thanks to George Al. Where's George? George and George Al Properties to help print this. And so this is for sale out in the garden. After if you go out and visit the With table, you could go out and get copies of this. Proceeds go or split to the Tobera Project and the MA. So please get it. It's beautiful. And it follows the exhibit that you could see upstairs. And second, just want you to encourage you, we'll have about an hour. You can look at the exhibit upstairs, but also please visit some of the tables outside. So some other projects, including With. The other thing that's available tonight is I'm Just Nosy, a guide to co-creation in Filipino archives with Filipino American community. It was produced by our undergrad, Maya Mislang. And it's made possible by Sam Riegel, who's a librarian in the special collections. And so through Sam, thank you, Sam, these are been printed beautifully and they're free. So please come talk to Maya. She'll share more about it. You can talk to others. It's about the process. So you can also visit the Tobera Project. Will be outside, so you can see some of their materials. And also other projects, the Lost Chinatown Project. Okinawa Memories Initiative will also be outside. And lastly, you'll find we also have, after that great talk about Filipino food and halo halo, we actually have Filipino desserts for everyone. So after we close, the desserts will be available in the tables in the back by the elevator. So please enjoy the desserts.
So I'm here to remind folks to please not bring the desserts into the galleries. There are places where you can keep your food outside, any other beverages too, but we also invite you to check out the other galleries as well, not just the one that has sowing seeds. I did want to reiterate also just with my co-PI, Steve, that this is really built on a lot of trust, and as Rudy said, trust is given, but it sure as hell is earned as well. So I just want to thank the fact that we have our community partners here who continue to support us. Many of them are in the audience. We really encourage you to talk to them. They're the experts that have really fueled this exhibition and this project. Roy is inside the room now. He's gotten a lot of words of praise, but I don't think they're enough. And I actually do think that all of us here really carry so much respect for Roy for having the energy to pull this project together, to make his vision come to life, and really at the end of the day, to make sure that his daughter knows the history of his family and his friends and his community. So thank you, Roy, for being here. I did want to say thank you also to all the people who've really just made this possible. California Humanities, of course, the Hellman Fellows Program of UC Santa Cruz, Sam Riegel of Special Collections, who helped fund the food, Rebecca London of the Center for Campus Plus Community, who actually really made it possible for Lead California to be here and believed in Watsonville as in the heart, to really be put up as an amazing kind of model project for our campus. I just want to say, too, that we're going to hold on to your questions. We got a lot of them, and we're really happy about that. And we want that to inform future programming. So keep an eye out. We have a couple last events for the exhibition, including a beautiful family day in July. We're going to have people creating an archive that's going to be given to special collections at UCSC. Take a photo in the photo booth that we're going to bring out. And we have a closing literature and poetry reading event on August 4th, the very last day of our exhibition. You again have your California Humanities Survey. Please fill it out. If there was something that you learned, please write it down. Your survey is going to help us, of course, give good information back to one of our major funders, and then also help us improve as a project. Sharon and Jose, who are in the audience, are going to help collect those surveys. Jose right here, Sharon's in the back. You can try to find them, but we also have some stations where you can leave the surveys as well. Alrighty, folks. And then finally, just one last shout out. This wouldn't be a project if we didn't have a lot of educational components to it. If you visit any of our tables, especially the Watsonville is in the Heart table, you're going to see some really amazing educational materials, a beautiful digital map that just launched in May that captures the Watsonville anti-Filipino race riots, but also community preservation and perseverance over the 20th century. High school and college level educational tools, a beautiful digital exhibit on cockfighting, among other topics. So please check it out. Really give a shout out to our undergraduate researchers who really pulled this off. So thank you again.